Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the case of Ursula and Sabina Eriksson? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoy this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I'll put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. So first I'll go through the background in this case, move to the timeline of the incidents, and then offer my analysis. Ursula and Sabina Eriksson were born in Sweden on November 3, 1967. They are identical twins. They had an older brother and an older sister. By the year 2000, Sabina was living in Ireland with her partner. She had 2 children, and Ursula had moved to the United States. The available evidence suggests that they had fairly normal lives. There was no reported history of mental illness, no trouble with the law, nothing that really stood out. On May 16, 2008, Ursula visited Sabina in Ireland. They left Ireland together and started making their way to Liverpool, England. It is believed they traveled by ferry. They made it to Liverpool the next day at 8:30 a.m. After arriving, they went to a police station in order to make a report about Sabina's children. Apparently, they were worried about the children. The police contacted the authorities in Ireland and learned that Sabina had been in an argument with her partner the night before. Ursula and Sabina boarded a bus to London at 11:30 a.m. Around 1 p.m., the bus driver noticed the behavior of the twins was erratic, so he stopped the bus at a rest area and asked them to exit. They tried to reboard the bus, but they would not let the bus driver search their bags for illegal items. They were holding their bags tightly in a suspicious manner. The bus driver contacted the manager of the rest area. The manager observed the same suspicious behavior, including how they were holding the bags, and called the police. Police officers would question the twins, but determined that they were harmless, so they left without doing anything. After this, the twins made their way by foot to the M6, which is a highway. They attempted to cross the highway. Sabina was hit by a car. The police arrived, and the pair was standing on the shoulder. As the police were trying to make sense of the situation, Ursula broke free and ran into the side of a tractor trailer, which was traveling over 50 miles an hour. She went under the wheels and was run over. Sabina darted out into traffic just after her. She was struck by a car. Both women sustained injuries. Ursula's legs were fractured, and Sabina was knocked unconscious. Paramedics attempted to treat Ursula, but she violently resisted them. She screamed at them, spit at them, and scratched them. All this with her legs being broken. She told one police officer who was trying to hold her, "I recognize you. I know you're not real." I bet that officer was disappointed. What a way to find out you're not real. After Sabina woke up, she yelled, "They're going to steal your organs." She stood up and started walking toward the median. She struck an officer in the face and ran into traffic on the other side of the highway. Several first responders and members of the public chased her down and grabbed her. The police handcuffed her, and she was sedated by the paramedics. The sisters were taken to the hospital. Ursula would remain there for some time, but Sabina would be released from medical care in 5 hours. She, of course, still had that little problem with the law. The police took her into custody. She was calm, non-combative. They didn't even handcuff her. Sabina would plead guilty on May 19, 2008, to charges connected with striking the officer and trespassing onto the highway. She was sentenced to 1 day in jail, but released because of time served. She walked out of court into the city of Stoke-on-Trent with her possessions in a clear plastic bag. She started looking for Ursula. She was trying to find the hospital that was treating Ursula. She came upon 2 men, Glenn Hollingshead and Peter Folie. They were friends who were walking a dog. She asked the men for directions to a hotel. Folie felt as though Sabina was acting strangely, like she was nervous, but Hollingshead felt badly for her and offered to take her back to his house. Folie went with them to the house. The 3 of them were at the house drinking and talking. Sabina appeared to be paranoid. She would get up frequently and look out of the window. She offered the men cigarettes, but then grabbed the cigarettes out of their mouths, saying they could be poisoned. Folie would leave for the evening, but Sabina spent the night. At around noon the next day, Hollingshead called his brother, asking about local hospitals apparently in an effort to find Ursula. Hollingshead was making dinner at around 7:40 p.m. when he went to a neighbor to borrow tea bags. About a minute after he re-entered his home, he came back outside yelling, "She stabbed me." He fell to the ground and died. Sabina had murdered him. Sabina fled the house on foot carrying a hammer as the neighbor called the police. As Sabina ran, she occasionally hit herself in the head with that hammer. A motorist saw her doing this and tried to tackle her to get the hammer away from her. While the two were wrestling, Sabina struck the motorist with a roof tile that she had in her pocket. At this point, paramedics were on the scene and they started chasing her. She jumped over a 40-foot high bridge onto another highway, the A50. This brought a sudden conclusion to the chase, as Sabina had fractured her skull and broken both ankles. She was discharged from the hospital on September 11, 2008, and promptly taken into custody. She was charged with murder the same day. Ursula was also released from the hospital in September. She moved back to Sweden and eventually to the United States. About a year later, Sabina would plead guilty to manslaughter with diminished responsibility. The judge determined that Sabina was only culpable at a low level and sentenced her to 5 years in prison. Moving to my analysis. During the court proceedings for Sabina, both the prosecution and the defense agreed that Sabina was insane. It's worth noting that the authorities believed that shortly after the incidents, the symptoms for Ursula and Sabina had resolved. It's not clear if they resolved completely or if just the psychotic portion had resolved. There were two different theories about what type of mental disorder Sabina may have been expressing during the incident. I'll review these two theories and talk about the disorders involved. The prosecution said that Sabina had acute polymorphic psychotic disorder, APPD. This disorder is in the ICD-10, but it's not in the DSM-5. APPD is in a category called acute and transient psychotic disorders. It is essentially the equivalent of brief psychotic disorder, which is featured in the DSM. In several sources related to this case, APPD was incorrectly referred to as acute polymorphic delusional disorder, but that's not what it's called. There's no disorder by that name. It's acute polymorphic psychotic disorder. The mistake with the name might be because in the ICD and the DSM, there's a disorder called delusional disorder. APPD involves the acute onset of psychosis within 2 weeks that resolves shortly thereafter. Depending on the type, it could be within 1 month or 3 months. So with psychosis, we would expect a break from reality, hallucinations, and delusions. Those would be the primary symptoms of APPD. This disorder is rare. It mostly affects women in early to middle adult life. The onset typically follows some type of stressor. So something terrible or something perceived as terrible happens in a person's life and they have this reaction. Perhaps an argument with a romantic partner, the death of a relative, losing a job, something like that. In addition to the time-related criteria, negative symptoms distinguish APPD from schizophrenia. Schizophrenia has negative symptoms, but APPD does not. Negative symptoms include symptoms like flat affect, poverty of speech, apathy, lack of social interest, inattention, and anhedonia. There are some other ones as well. Negative symptoms are considered particularly treatment resistant. Individuals with APPD are more likely to develop other serious disorders like schizophrenia and major mood disorders. So this isn't a disorder where if somebody had it, we would look at them and say, well, everything's going to be just fine once the symptoms resolve. This is a serious disorder that indicates a fair likelihood of substantial mental health problems in the future. It is a warning sign that should not be ignored. It usually just doesn't mean the person's going to be fine. Now, as far as this particular case with the Eriksson twins, what doesn't make sense here about this particular theory is why would they both happen to develop the same rare disorder at the same time? It could be that one developed APPD or something like it, and the other one was affected by what is referred to as Folie à deux, otherwise known as shared psychotic disorder. This brings me to the theory of the defense attorneys in this case. They argued that Folie à deux was at work. Specifically, Ursula was the primary partner and Sabina was the secondary partner. Folie deux is a fascinating disorder. Technically, it is no longer in the DSM. It last appeared as shared psychotic disorder in the DSM-4 TR. It is still considered to be an actual construct. Like it does happen, it would just be part of another diagnosis like delusional disorder. The term folie deux means madness shared by two. It has been referred to by many other names as well, like psychosis of association, induced psychosis, communicated psychosis, simultaneous psychosis, imposed psychosis, and double insanity. That name always struck me as peculiar. Like regular insanity is not good enough, make mine a double. The disorder can feature many people, but most of the time it only features two people. A primary partner who has the delusion first, so they are affected by something like schizophrenia, delusional disorder, or a major mood disorder with psychosis, like depression or bipolar disorder, and this affects the secondary partner. So the secondary partner starts manifesting delusional behavior as well, almost like they were contaminated or infected by the primary partner. Primary and secondary partners are members of the same family 90% of the time, and 1/3 of the time they are siblings. The theory with this case of Ursula and Sabina Eriksson would be that when the two came together, Ursula's psychosis started affecting Sabina, but when the two were separated, the psychosis eventually resolved. So specifically, this would be considered imposed psychosis, a type of shared psychotic disorder where the delusions disappear when the pair separates. There's another type, simultaneous psychosis, which is when both partners are exposed to the same stressor and develop delusions at the same time. That's a possibility as well. It's hard to know what actually happened in this case. We can't even really be sure it was shared psychotic disorder. I guess one could argue it was the least creative reenactment of the Wonder Twins that has ever been attempted. Shape of running into traffic, form of running into traffic. The Wonder Twins were these superheroes from a long time ago. Unfortunately, shared psychotic disorder does have a strong relationship with homicide, which might explain why Sabina murdered a man. Homicide with this disorder is usually tied to one of three motives: defensive functioning, they are frightened and defend themselves; obstruction of a fulfillment of the delusion, like the victim is getting in their way; and threatened separation of the dyad. So in this case, Ursula was separated from Sabina, and Sabina was trying to reunite with her. It also has a strong relationship with suicide after the homicide, which almost happened in this case. Sabina jumped off of a 40-foot bridge. This is usually considered inconsistent with continued survival. Again, there is no way to know what happened in this case. I think shared psychotic disorder is a reasonable theory. What strikes me as unusual here is that the necessary ingredients for shared psychotic disorder do not really seem to be in place. For example, there was no history of mental illness for the primary partner, or the secondary partner, for that matter. They were not isolated only with each other. Usually in these cases, we see the partners spend a lot of time with one another and without other people around. They don't see other family members too often. They don't see neighbors. They don't go to school. That's not what happened in this case. These two seem to be living just fine independently, and when they got together, everything changed. The other part that doesn't make sense about this theory is the outcome. Usually both people in these situations have a long road ahead of them as far as treatment. As far as I know, Ursula and Sabina are back in the population and doing well. That's not unheard of with shared psychotic disorder, but it would not be the expected result. I think the concern in this case is that there's this idea that everything is fine now. A family member of the murder victim has expressed concern over the fact that Sabina is free. I think this concern is legitimate and warranted. The fact is that Sabina murdered a man, and even though it might have been due to a mental disorder, if that cause has not been determined, how do we know the risk going forward? It appears as though more answers were needed in this case, and more caution was needed until those answers were obtained. Those are my thoughts on the case of Ursula and Sabina Eriksson. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be interesting. Thanks for watching.